Señoras y señores, muy buenos días. La Universidad de Chile agradece su presencia y les da la más cordial de las bienvenidas a la conferencia anual del Consorcio de Centros e Institutos de Humanidades 2023. Este consorcio es un foro mundial que fortalece el trabajo de los centros e institutos de humanidades a través de la promoción, la concesión de subvenciones y la colaboración
grants and the inclusive cooperation by promoting as interinstitutional associations recognizing the regional cultures of humanities, by mobilizing the collective capacity of the humanities in order to approach the current problems of society. Today and on June 24th, the Interdisciplinary Centers of Studies in Philosophy, Art and Humanities of the University of Chile will be the venue for the annual conference. We thank you for your presence at this opening. We thank you, Professor Rosa Devés, President of the University of Chile, Professor Javier Dinero, Co-President of the Consortium of Center and Center of Humanities, and the Professor Pablo Oyarzún, Head Director of the Interdisciplinary Center of Studies in Philosophy, Arts and Humanities. We take this opportunity to greet the presence of the attendees. At the beginning, I will offer the floor to the President Rosa Devés, President of the University of Chile. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor, and I'm pleased to be here to house at this university the annual conference of the Consortium of Centers and Institute of Humanities, the one we are called by the Interdisciplinary Centers of Studies in Philosophy, Arts and Humanities of the University of Chile, under the name Conmotions, Critical Distance and Construction of the Common. The Chile University, or University of Chile, is a public entity. Historically, in this nation, declared in a statute of 2006, the commitment establishes the commitment of answering, and I quote, the requirements of the nation by constituting itself as an intellectual reserve characterized by an ethical and social conscience. And at the same time, it could mean to contribute to the development, sustainable development of the country by contributing to the solution of their problems from the university perspective towards the greater good common, inspiring democratic assets. It is important to remind these commitments to understand that the organization of this conference has an enormous importance to us, particularly when we know that the great challenges of our world in crisis require, from the critical approximations humanities may offer, the questions on how and what to think about the revolts and the civil upliftings during the last decades. It's also the question the citizenship is asking. Approaching it from the compared perspective of the different disciplines is fundamental to understand what is assumed by constructing or building the common. This is why we share the importance of analyzing different movements causing great expectations, but they didn't have the strategic to consolidate this in time of a social transformation, of a progressive transformation. In Chile, in the last decade, has been precisely one with commotions. The students' movement in 2006, there were regional protests, the feminist movement in 2018, the social revolt of October 2019. However, the pandemic and their consequences had opened some space to some voices reclaiming voices from the government, and the safety may displace safety as the great demand by the citizenship. This is how it's been installed, a sort of restoration, a conservative restoration. What has happened what is happening are questions we can hear at different points, at different places, day by day. And this precisely happens when we commemorate the 50 years of the coup d'etat and we write a new constitution. This is how democracy, the breaking of democracy and the most horrible violation to human rights face to face with the definition of the norms regulating our democratic coexistence and will constrain the power. It is not easy to have a unique response on the origins and consequences of the social movement, but there is a relative consensus of the need to build a common framework, allowing the expression of the different social powers. The horizon of the common have been translated in the Chilean case in giving us this new constitutional text, replacing the constitution originated during the dictatorship, and based on that to process the political differences. That understanding skills should collect the mobilization expressions starting 1 decade ago and guarantee that social rights will be enshrined constitutionally and open spaces to the citizenship participation in their own constitutional text. Humanities have a lot to say, have a lot to contribute to the desolation of these things, and their contribution is urgent. In that sense, there's nothing to celebrate. Well, we have to celebrate this call to understand not only the revolt, but the construction of the common, the one that is implied in the program in each social attempt, in this possibility where many of these processes are still ongoing and we require new approximations, new etymologies and new methodologies from of a profound understanding and a critical distancing that will finally be fruitful. And as we know, in our country, they represent efforts, important effort for many researchers who jointly with analyzing these processes are questions in their condition of citizens in the current context. Building a political community is such a challenge, as it is expressed in the question that will be debated over today. Even how challenging they are, it must be a commitment from the different stakeholders, from the organizations, citizens going through the academic and the political movement. It is important to channel the differences, and action socials will not be vanished, but they might be processed in a more harmonical way if all the inhabitants in this territory at least consider that we share the basic regulations or rules to peacefully share. The discussion will be an fundamental supply from the humanities so that humanities can understand this changing society. We congratulate the center, the Interdisciplinary Center, Philosophy, Arts and Humanities, and particularly the Director Pablo Oyarzún. We also welcome Javier Durán to this conference, and we thank you for considering this year the University of Chile the best space to reflect upon the social commotion. Thank you very much to everyone. We thank the presence and the words by Rosa Devés, the President of the University of Chile. Now we'll offer the floor to the Professor Pablo Oyarzún, Director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Studies in Philosophy, Arts and Humanities. Good afternoon, dear President, dear Veronica, dear Javier, and all the people, all the attendees in this meeting. I will be very brief. I just want to welcome you all, to greet you all, to all people coming from other countries. We are pleased to have you all here. I want to say this. I want to particularly acknowledge, since I am part of this center, and I want to thank for this World Forum, which is vital for the development not only of humanities, but also the development of societies, as long as humanities have a critical contribution and fundamental contribution to that development and to all the problems our society face. Particularly, we should, from this global thought, I do celebrate that this meeting, the 20th annual meeting, is held in the South Global in Chile. We've been in South Africa before, in Cape City. It is fundamental to have this type of dialogue, this type of conversation amidst the different sectors and regions of the world, because that's that fits not only our ways of thinking, it fits our experiences. From there they emerge, from their ways of thinking emerge. So basically, I want to welcome you warmly to all of you, and thank you for being here. Thank you very much, Professor Oyarzún. Now we'll invite to this stage Professor Javier Durán, co-president of the Consortium of Centers and Institutes of Humanities. Good afternoon to everyone. Dear President Dr. Devés, Dr. Pablo Oyarzún, dear colleagues, dear attendees, it's such an honor, a privilege to address you as a co-president of the Consortium of the Center for Humanities, CHCI, in its English acronym. Unfortunately, my colleague and co-president, I hope, cannot be here. However, I like to acknowledge and publicly thank their contributions to the work done this year by the consortium. In the same way, I would like to express my gratitude to the University of Chile and the cultural community of Santiago for welcoming us so warmly, and all the organization behind this allowing us to be here today. We express our gratitude to the President Devés, the organizing committee consisting of Pablo Oyarzún, Andrés Claro, Constanza Rivano, along with Ranjana Cano and Emily, a group that unceasingly worked to organize and to put all this together, promising dialogues around commotions. For those who are not familiar with the consortium, I will briefly describe what this is. Was founded in 1888. CHCI has a membership of 300 organizations in the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Australasia. The membership is diverse. It includes universities, institutes, libraries, and other higher education institutions, all connected to humanities, defined in a broad way and an interdisciplinary way. Emerging in the United States context, this consortium has exponentially grew in the last 15 years. Today, 40% of the membership is outside North America. From our last meeting in the Duke University, United States last year, we have experienced an unprecedented period for the CHCI as we have entered in a post-pandemic global moment where the hope, resilience, and a careful optimism mark the mood guidelines to continue with our mission. Besides, we have had our first co-presidency, and we are about to finish this transition to welcome on June the 1st to our elect president, Dr. Stephen Best from Berkeley University, here with us today. As a co-president, Dean Harper and myself would like to convey our gratitude to the Board of Directors, Advisory Board for their trust and support, and the executive team of the CHCI, particularly Aaron Frey, because of their excellent work to sustain the efforts of the consortium. I take this opportunity to acknowledge the foundational task of 3 former presidents of the consortium, here present, who at different points in time push for the internationalization of this group, Kathy Woodrow, Ian Bucon, and Zara Goyer. And it is precisely during the presidency of Zara where the consortium started a systematic and serious work of proselytism in Latin America with a meeting of the board of directors in Buenos Aires in 2017, where there were the first guidelines for the Interdisciplinary Center of Studies in Philosophy, Arts, and Humanities of the University of Chile, led by Pablo, welcoming us today. As of then, CHCI has increased their efforts in the region. This year, we have conducted several virtual meetings, assembly types, town hall type, as the one conducted in January, led by myself and Pablo Oyarzún, which constitute the first assembly in Spanish of the CHCI of the humanities in Latin America. This as part of our efforts to promote the work of the consortium. The same way, beyond, we had a virtual meeting with several directors of humanities, where the Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, the biggest university in America, in their interest to join the consortium, and we hope to see them in the next annual meeting. I also take this opportunity to welcome 4 new members of the Board of Directors, Kader Kanuk, Kyle Meze-Jones, Christopher Newfield, and Privy Mitel. I also invite you to consult, to refer to our annual report, where they will see the great diversity and variety of tasks of our members. Our networks have done different types of job, and 6 groups of work receive funding under the recently created funds for membership to build meetings and to conduct several academic activities. We like to recognize the University Teresa Magnitude Cristina Chia and Republic in the conduction of this program in cooperation with Fight. Finally, it is important to comment how rich the program is, the intersection of the Congress with the social problems of century 21st, where humanities and how humanities are broadly defined are fundamental in the study, analysis, and offer for solutions sustainable and viable. Therefore, this conference attempts to explore on what to think about this phenomenon, articulating the commotions phenomenon as an index of the times with the critical distancing, activating the methodologies and epistemologies of the humanities, and the construction of the common as a task, as an urgent task. Some of the questions guiding our conversations already expressed in the program are: what are the approximate methodological approximation and epistemological of the humanities to think of intervening, what's public? Is it viable, the critical distancing as an answer amidst these contemporary urgencies that seems to demand immediate intervention, and which possibilities can we construct the common, and how to respond the challenge of building community without the appropriation of what's common? It captures our attention a new meeting in CHCI, which is the Latin American session, Native Epistemology Ruptures in the Indigenous Days in Chile, of the Indigenous People Days. We will explore focus on the native epistemology and with the discernment, with the interrogation and perspectives of humanities on a national, regional, and global level. And this is something that has an incidence in several communities on the world and is extremely important. I conclude by one more time thanking our hosts for their hospitality and wishing you an excellent conference. Thank you very much, Professor Durán. We'll start now the opening speech in charge of Professor Verónica Gago, political science academic from the University of Buenos Aires, sociology professor at the Institute of High Studies of the University of San Martin, and author of Feminist International, and co-author of a feminist reading of this with Luci Cavallero, feminist activist and member of the collective No One Less, or Ni Una Menos.
Thank you very much to the director, the first president in the history of the university. She's the first female one, so that's very important to celebrate. I also want to thank Pablo Oyarzún because of the invitation, the personal invitation, to the Consortium of Humanities and the organization of this event, and everyone that has been involved, so that these days can be fructiferous in conversation. I want to start with the notion of commotion, because I think it's very suggestive as a language of the social change, of the transformations that we are interested to expand and think. But that at the same time, it's a notion that can bring problems. It's spasmodic. What comes after the commotion, we may think? How long it lasts? Is it destined to produce corporal memory, or more than structure, to relieve that distinction as exclusive? At a moment, we thought that the consequences and sequences of this are distributed between reform and revolution. How the revolution or their threats to the possibilities, and how in every reform we could read a communist moment. And in those read a peace revolution. This formula can afterwards be associated with a variation more known as non-reformist reforms of André Gorz, and in other way more close to our continent, close to the plebeian democratizations, to talk about our continent. I think it's very important to bring back the formulation of Rosa Luxemburgo to compose reform and revolution, where that temporality appears as simultaneous, as a non-exclusive disjunction. It does that as a concept that it's very important to get together with reform, which is realpolitik, that it looks a movement of mutual imbrication in a politic that comes from below. This puts us in a place where we need to follow a development of relation of processes in where the discussion is made in every place and every blocking. That's how a teleology of the final objective moves without analyzing itself. It is created with this concept of Luxemburg, a strategic temporality, which is what we're all the time invoking. What is the display in the present time as a way of appropriation of possible futures? This is how we work into existing contradictions without hoping the people absolutely liberated and clear. I like this notion to think about it together with commotion, because it talks about rupture of action without leaving the question aside of how those ruptures alter the exploitation and what are the fails in this. And this
maybe the notion of commotion in this line of thinking is a little away of the realpolitik, and that's a problematic point to think about. Probably, if we continue with the speculation, the image of commotion is for another binomium of concept, which is the one of commotions and capture. The question is it enough with despair? Is it just a language displacement, a search for terms for the present time? I underline this about time because probably commotion and capture is a way to evidence the acceleration of the processes, the way to experience the time of changes and the modalities where changes are neutralized, coded, or even against us, playing against us. Probably we might be back with this classic term counter-revolution as the rapid dynamic we are experiencing. We have here another problem of how to associate distance and commotion, one of the words of the name of this conference. Do we have any possible safeguard in commotion, or will the critic will be a temporary distance, an involuntary one once we are out of this commotion? Then we have the problem besides time and the speeds of change of the position and localization of how are we placed for the critic. But there is something that's for sure, a commotion, a revolt, a revolution, even being defeated, is already a starting point for the building of the common. The building of the common, the third point here included. These starting reflections are to trying to understand why I have been inviting for this opening conference, why this thematic debt. I will take it in the following perspective. First, trying to understand how the financing dynamics have found in the debt, particularly in the debt towards the under sectors, a way to recover and appease the moments of commotions, of revolt, and collective and radical collective organization. I will try to think the debt as a pacification device. Learn how the debt effectively works as a capture by reading on the level of the flow the elements of this commotion, these changes in the sensitiveness and the infrastructures for the social reproduction, apparently contradictory with the prior. The debt should be thought as an activation device, then the debt as a form of exploitation, and finally we can mark how we can say how the debt is an element of the individualized responsabilization containing in an own scheme the radical depossession. We can talk about of this of contention, of this triangle of the debt as an activation, as a pacification, as contention, is the way I will try to relate to some recent and old research. In a more general way and as a hypothesis of work, I believe that studying the debt in our countries, referring to commotion and contra-revolution, is a way to understand the capital plan today, which systemically connects the war, crisis, and debt. And specifically, I'm interested in specifying why the feminist perspective provides a privileged standpoint to understand the debt as a war mechanism in and against social reproduction. Then, to start with the first point, the debt as pacification. I made my research in the last decade as the financing articulation was able to connect social inclusion, consumption, and indebting in sectors usually characterized as marginal, excluded, or directly catalogued as a superfluous population. It was a point where in our country, without a doubt, we debated over the possibility of this post-neoliberalism moment as an open space due to the revolts at the beginning of this century, the same that gave the possibility to reach power to governments that reivindicate popular. I was interested particularly in the way of or how a state political recognition for demand of the social movement was channeled through some grant that, thanks to a political dispute, stopped being temporary and under emergency, and they became regular income for a majority. Those income were a way of banking of the popular sector and then of indenting for the consumption of no long-lasting assets and cheap assets at a very high interest rates, and also a way of access to privatized services. From here, I got interested in how the reproduction of life was configured and how the informal ways of work became a massive and at the same time politicized massive reality. What was the role of social inclusion pushed by state grants, and how these mechanisms became social reproduction from the landing of the debt and this nurturing, were nurtured of modalities of self-management or unpatterned work. The singular elements of this analysis can be synthesized like this. First, their relation of a recognition policy of social demands translated in state intervention policies, and even at a rights widening moment. The second part, the capitalization of debt in popular economies, these economies that proliferate being part of the social movement, which are a way of the debt does not require the mediation of the salary by expanding in a new way the funding architecture. The third point, the link with a macrostructural moment of economic growth and increase in the commodities export, and finally the reorganization of the social movement dynamics structure and stabilize as popular economies to ensure the reproduction of great majorities as a metabolization of the destructuralization and informalization of the labor market. In this way, and to discuss the ways of neoliberalisms in our region and not take already made definitions, I try to identify how exploitation is rooted in the production of subjectivities that are compelled to the precariousness and at the same time blotting over to thrive in structural conditions and how financing dynamics adhere to that subjectivity, and a real translation devices capable to read that situation. It was finances with their high degree of abstraction, those who took charge of the articulation under a subjectivity where they should ensure progress without ensuring privilege of salary. As a matter of fact, social movements thought in their continuity by the popular economics express a narrow link between a class dimension that from some readings only means disclassing, therefore victimization, and from other, the ones I am interested in, a new composition of class, when the idea, even when the idea of new is a way of saying variation, not an absolute novelty in our region, where the non-salary processes of a great part of the population are a key element of the structural heterogeneity. It's just that in neoliberalism, this heterogeneity has another understanding framework. I am here in a dialogue with someone that is doing their research, Martina Arboleda, trying to think of the notion of combined extractivism in an equal, something we have to think of at this current point. What I was interested in is to understand how the articulation between revolt and progressist government, in the sense that it extends and translates a set of social mandates against austerity and impunity, expressed an articulation between state grant and indebting for consumption without structural investments, inherent to an articulation with the global market, neo-extractivists modifying work patterns of consumption in the majorities, and above all expanded a neoliberalism from below, a way to assume the calculation where we overlay a neoliberal rationality with a repertoire of community practices, popular practices, a way to relate to the conditions existing, to the existing conditions. This is a way to understand how the social reproduction is also a homogeneous process in the global south, and to understand finance as an opportunist system of the exchange or production exchanges originated in the crisis. However, they are not discontinued in an economic growth moment. This is the way we consolidate reproduction modalities, which at the same time tension and leverage neoliberal forms, going away from the fully victimist landscapes as the entrepreneurial. More recently, Aris Comporosos proposes to rethink of this subjectivity in terms of a homos economicus to the homos speculans, to evidence a collective conditions we have to treat with the uncertainty and the opacity of our daily life, which in other philosophical terms, I was trying to think based on Palono Virno, who referred this to an mass opportunism. This is the reading capacity for opportunities in instability situations expressed as political subjectivity. I think those are elements to think of these subjectivities in no moralizing terms, but directly policies implying speculation dynamics. But what the Greek author underlines is the acceleration of the speculation condition by means of digital technologies commercializing. Therefore, they propose at their digital infrastructure that propension to speculate in a collective way, which is no other way to say imagine what's coming. And I will be back to this point later. These debates, processes, continue to be key to understand how we produce the infiltration of this new neoliberalism from below, and how we can understand as an ambivalent dynamic and adaptations. And besides, to me, it was important the twist, the turn to the right, and the way we articulate neo-extractivism and neo-developmentalism. Those were occluded due to the virulence, at least in Argentina, what came later. What came later, and I mean by this, the ultra-neoliberal government by Mauricio Macri, who made it to include, on the level of democratic political system, a fraction of the capital that at that point didn't have any internal political representation in the country. What was done by dictatorship at some point. We could thought with more horror in the case of Brazil and probably in another sequence for Chile. In Argentina, the return to the IMF in 1928 marks a consolidation point of this twist, expressing, as it is stated by the economist Eduardo Basualdo, the beginning of a period of finding valorization that put international funding to command the productive process. Unlike the valorization model coming from dictatorship we watched broken in the 21 crisis led by entrepreneurial crisis.
The social plans right now that are turning right, these subsidies that I was talking about before, are not shortened. Actually, the opposite. When we thought there were a speculation that they would be social, but they are restrained in the forms of endowment with some accelerated improvement. From here, the finance acceleration, it manages to take a leap quantitative and qualitative, being a symptom of the new cycle of endowment. The endowment, external endowment record that the FMI gave with its history, together with the acquisitive power of salaries, it made mandatory some things like medicine and food. This reality affected to women of the most popular sections, and an eloquent show of this was the massive endowment of the people through maternity, which is a specific subsidy. The debt as a financial technology was capitalized directly as a repair through precarization. The particularity about this phenomenon is that endowment it made itself some compulsive way to complete the salaries in a free fall. Whether these endowments are or not salary, they cannot guarantee anymore the social reproduction. The endowment in houses under the form of to be indebted just to live, it's still unmediated through salary, but yes, because it does through the statal offers, through these credititious offers that really give us more violence when it's not complied. In that same moment, we are in Argentina in the peak of the feminist mobilization. We are impulsing dynamics of politicization and collectivization of the financial problem that proposes specifically a feminist lecture of the debt in homes and its connections in the indebtedness cycle. So from 2017, we launched the slogan, alive, free, and not in debt we want ourselves. That way to intersect the themes of sexist violence and economic violence, it became a powerful key of this social movement. The slogan is, with all of us, and it started from the 8th of March of 2020, and taken for syndicates, universities, migrant collectivists, the protest of the pride. And it made a slogan of general comprehension, a way of efficient orientation. Why is it pedagogy at scale on the debt and not the payment to the FMI? Because the feminist movement empowered the ways of understanding what we understand about not paid labor. And finally, because why the social reproduction is in the center of a compression from beneath, from the subsoils of the reproduction, and in a scale that it's beyond the notion of the domestic confinement. To discuss finances in terms of conflictivity of the everyday problems with concrete narrations, corporeal, situated, and therefore a problem that could be key to be read also in terms of self-defense of the self-autonomies in front of violences. I think that this movement also makes a discussion of how we use that debt as a way of pacification. The most interesting in terms of the first moment of financing is the capacity of initiatives of the feminist movement to make this problem, to understand this endowment as a problem in a moment that we had austerity politics, and finally to show how the articulation with the mandates of gender were being a problem. To make these problems as a key piece of political work, it allowed to launch in the public debate, the external debt itself with other political grammatics. This is a way, the speculation is a way of management of time, and to open it to what was happening, and to do it from Latin American, and here I evoke Josefina Lodmer, which was permanently worried to authorize Latin America to do this speculation. And that same knowledge about what comes ahead is what financiers try to make their own. This is what refers also the notion of speculative communities. He talks about, Camporos, a imaginative capacity that nowadays is channeled through digital connections pre-established, coming from a dispute territory and value extraction. So if we understand endowment historically as an answer to a specific sequence of fights, to understand the process of decolonization of the countries, then it's also as a mechanism of extraction of time of life and work, configuring again the notion itself of class that has pushed the feminist movement, I think. Coming back to the main hypothesis, endowment works retroactively as a double temporal sequence, as a machine of capture of social inventions dedicated to the self-management of the work through the beginning of the century, and as a codification of the politicization of the social reproduction. In this way, the social protest gives us the coordinates of how this has been organized from expansion as a dispositive from the government, and especially feminism. The feminist lecture of the DEP that connects the reproductive work and the work on the land, capitalized as a domestic debt, especially directed to women and what they're called head home, in a moment of the feminist movement that expresses its massive force in houses and in the streets.
I'm back in the notion of functioning of the debt as a vector of pacification. I believe that this finds as an antagonism the way on how the feminist movement has pointed out that the debt is violence. It's a motto, it's a simple phrase, it's repeated, but it's not evident, and it operates against the abstraction, that's financing abstraction, in such a way that this specific place for research, the possibility to make a feminist reading of the dead has had as a condition of possibility a feminist mobilization process giving centrality to the debate of the violences, populating of concrete images what we can call neoliberal violence, and a whole debate on the historical relation in our continent between neoliberalism and violence. It's there where the possibility of critique reaches all their power to deploy it. This is what I think in the moment. The next thing I want to refer to is the debt as an activation of ways of exploitation. We can read in the course of Michel Foucault an analogy between the appearance of the punitive society. They say that both are analyzing a way of equivalences where at times the unchangeable measure with what we paid. Salary and prison are connected as historically formulas specific for appropriation of time. However, salary works by exploiting a work done already at the same time that prison captures a coming time. In this sense, the prison looks more like a that way. Both prison and debt works on the future time. But if prison fixes and disciplines those debts, gives you work, mobilizes and commands the relation with the temporality in the future, assuming no funding obligation, is a fundamental element to understand the importance it acquires in the legal dimension as the moralization of incompliance, particularly towards the youth and the head of the household. This, what Foucault thought of as a permanent transcription of the morality and the lay, approaches the relation between the debts and their moral conditionings. But the debt in relation to the specificity we were thinking about here, it holds and activates a way of work that is not confined or is not exclusively confined to salary, is what allows us to think of the debt in terms of financial extractivisms. At the same time, the financial obligation to those who are not recognized as a labor subject make them contractual subject. In current or in present conditions, however, connections are much more fluid. It is those who have to sustain their status of unemployed to collect a grant, but think that grant does not guarantee it's insufficient. They have to collect those two incomes by choosing other type of job. It has to be an informal job, otherwise they will lose the other source of income, which is the grant. The common element is that those types of income are absorbed by the debt, that operationalizes the capture, at the same time exploitation and value extraction. In order to comply these multiple occupations, we also use infrastructure and reproduction work of different type. Family arrangements, entertainment platforms, caring community spaces reorganized for and due to the debt. Then the division between recognized and unrecognized work again is required by the sustaining of a social policy that, however, it is insufficient for the reproduction. It involves a calculation regarding the salary possibility extremely precarious. The debt questions this group of works, non-recognized workers, and they are free consumers, where the political representation does not recognize the attribute of freedom and property on their own selves. They are sub-workers, so granted or subsidized people. Finance do. Then that financial subjectivations advances and trains what then a more versatile right wing will know how to call the notion of freedom and the ways of property sustained in impoverishment. Therefore, the debt articulated to the push of entrepreneurialism, condition totally compatible to the subsidized work, and articulated with the dynamics of self-management, allows the work of platforms, for example, of the virtual fair exposure to deliveries, allow them to buy their ways of production, communication, and transport. A paradoxical inverted situation, the workers must be the owners of the means they produce. We are talking about cheap means used particularly in the service sector or informal sale spaces or cooperative ways. Even though it is a modality expanding in the most impoverished sectors, the acquisition of the production means is through a debt, then again containing a proprietary scheme of radical disposition. The
pandemic comes to shut down that cycle of debate of indebtedness in feminist fighting. Even though in Argentina the persistence of the mobilization in inept conditions allowed in December of 2020 the legalization of the abortion and an occupation of the streets that was shocking after a lot of months of lockdown. The kind of replay that required the pandemic, it aims to show and evidence what the movement showed as oppression and exploitation. Afterwards, the urgency dedicated to attend the social reproduction that broke with the COVID crisis imposes at least as a tendency to undo the disobedience imposed in terms of questioning of the home as a secure space. The spaces of proximity also had an effect of segmentation according to classes, that they were key in the alliances trans-feminist, but also the feminist strike, it came back as a boomerang, as intensification of those tasks. The same ones were reivindicated publicly in the pandemic in a symbolic way, but not in a salary way. So the problem of the work, reproductive work, as synonym of non-paid work, and the connection between violence and free work. And the politicization of the social reproduction. In the empiric investigation, at that moment, we saw that there was a rising of the endowment, domestic endowment for those basic endowment. In second place, and particularly, a proliferation of endowment for renting, and also taking some debts not to be kept without a home. And finally, the intrusion of technology, better known as fintech, inside of the homes through mobile payments, electronic wallets, and digital banks. So the novelty of the pandemic has been to experience, in terms of a group of questions, sensitive and effective, that the feminist movement in these last years had been made possible to visualize these problems. So what I want to say with this is that the pandemic wouldn't have been the same without the fight of the feminisms, especially the problem of the non-remunerated and remunerated work, where the debt has a key role as a structural dynamic. Then, as a second movement, if the pandemic has worked as a laboratory for the reconfiguration in terms of patriarchal and familiarist links, the feminist movement has opposed to the construction of these networks and a bet for the de-domestication of the care processes. We have found spaces of financial recolonization for the capital, given to the global rise of energy, food, and housing. So the pandemic has tried to repatriarize something called back to order. So here we try to make something evident, the hypothesis that where the restructuration of the relationships of classes are a principle seen as a reproduction in connection to extractive dynamics. That insecurity is answered simultaneously with new ways of violence that also include promises of order and financial contention, and the link between both of them is fundamental.
The pandemic in Argentina, not only in Argentina, gave way to a new wave of this called financial inclusion through the extension of emergency grants to millions of people during those months. Many of those have to indebt in the bank to obtain. The indebtment in the bank or the banking played a key role in the capacity of the state to intervene in the situation of emergency, and there was a clear intention of the public bank to favor this work. However, in the light of the financial system in the indebting context, structural with Luci Cavallero and Celeste Pedrosino, we started to research and problematize some points of the notion of financial inclusion that was relaunched under the crisis of 2008. First, on how, in the case of Argentina, it connects to a population with insufficient incomes or directly with no income. In the banking circuits, part of the private indebtment to very high rates in the last year, and part of a financial circuit which is the same, being a protagonist of the exchange to devaluate the currency, Argentinian currency, in the same case because it's accelerated impoverishment and precarization to millions of, even when we know the short transfer of money transfer, currency transfer, then the duration of that subsidy is determined by an imposition of the IMF. In third place, there are data of this population that might be commercialized or used to direct new credit offers. In fourth place, because it is simultaneous to the apparition of new technologies, the ones I was talking, to mediate this collection. Then we have a debate between companies and public banks to coexist. We have some processes here of what Silva Federici called social reproduction, financial colonization, and we try to think in relation of the finance as key elements in key areas such as housing, education, health, to analyze their link with the sexist violences. What I want to see are revolts unveil everything that feminist perspective have been reading as hidden places of reproduction, something in the region that was never so hidden, but in these social reproduction areas, non-salary first, and then in the way the feminist mobilization intervenes by politicizing in a subversive way that social reproduction shows us as a canvas, an open canvas where there are speed dynamics practice. Then it works on two tendencies. We can think of two orientations, what is reproductive and extractive. Here we have a bigger problem that I consider an open question, particularly by the feminisms, which are the political tools for protest and negotiation of a labor force that is between the financial extractivism, capitalism platforms, and the non-guaranteed social reproduction. I want to refer to this, not to extend on my speech on how we can explain today, at least in Argentina, between this brutal crisis in a very orientated to the right scenario, political scenario, where the IMF demands cuts at the same time funding the accountability of emergency subsidies. We see here not only a way to destabilize the minimum sustainable, but also an extreme focalization aiming to continue the emergency condition of pandemic as a permanent condition. Now, what is the common element for the cut of plans or for the non-obtention of extraordinary aid for only one time, and this was debated in different feminist assemblies? Those aids are not obtained if we count those who apply for this, if they had been in some type of financial movement. And what are these financial movements about, which are the conditions for exclusion to be or to receive those extraordinary aids? That might be the purchase of dollar or the use of virtual wallets. What type of dollar buy could we be talking about for the type of population that is under the line of poverty? Those who buy the saving dollar, this is what was said, and they pay in dollars for children games, so platforms such as Netflix. Then the circuit, financial inclusion, penalization of financial behavior is a contendent mission. How, through the adjustment, the role of the state is annulled by promoting the bancarization as a means of access, promote it as right, to then later use the same data as a way to discriminate and focalize the access to other emergency income. The entertainment platforms such as Netflix and video games work at the same time as different testimonies as dollarized infrastructure for mothers' burden of work. Then the buy of saving dollar is just the sending of money for migrant workers. Those consumption, they are penalized because they are in dollars. They recharge the moralization when it's about impoverished sectors and particularly women. The restriction of use of virtual wallets included as financial movements are the ones used to buy food and to ask for more credit for their life. This feel the penalization, but it's also...
It's not only selective, but it also blames the financial movements that are carried out of the substance after they have been organized. This happened, as I wanted to emphasize, especially what I call the single-parent household, where other infrastructures of work and care are already becoming evident. Not just a change of who is the head of the house. In another way, when the head of the house is not the one that, the male is not the one that organizes, but there's also an alteration of the political order that was sustained on. The financial movements are adhered on those alterations, making this dynamic of financing in replacement of the male provider. When I said about the orientation to the reproduction, I also refer to this responsibility of taking care, intensification of the reproductive work, and capitalization of the financing movements of an infrastructure of the everyday life. If the money is what created the possibility of shortage, then now it's the financial movements what allows to elude the scene of lack, the absolute lack that has been evident in other moments of the crisis. The polarity, shortage and accumulation are conjugated in a different way, as accumulation of debts and at the same time reading a new composition, sexual affective, of the impoverished homes. Finally, the dynamics of inclusion, that those the ones that work over the capture of inclusion, predatory inclusion. That's how Taylor spoke about them, the predatory inclusion, to signal the politics of mortgage of the black population after the crisis of 2008. That's where the common is evident. It's evident where there's a materiality, where the notion of the proprietary is now in question. That is what Butler has been talking about and theorization about independence. That's why in his words, the property as private describes my body or presumed individuality as accepted as a methodology. It's not about asking if reproduction is something about violence, but something actually quite the opposite. There is where some predatory machines are in that violent operations, extractions of the capital, because there's where the concrete politics prosper of limit demarcation and feminist, popular and communitary organizations that are capable of counter methodologies. Those counter methodologies are not unidirectionalities, and they deal and compete with the versatility that the traduction finances make. Of true world war and productive force, as Marx says, and the continues with the critical. So it's fundamental to deepen this debate, to understand the conservative reaction as a politic that wants to talk back, that with its reaction it looks to stay with a realistic balance, and they are dynamic democratically. From there, the right wings of today have movements of sentiments and sense where they try to make new interpolations, especially between those who have that everyday war and those who are taking away the role of provider. The expansion of the debt works as a dynamic at the same time of contention that organizes a certain experience of the current crisis, at the same time making it a continuum, being able to gesture the emergency.
The Luci Cavallero in the antidote quote Mark by saying that at some point the capital performs the role of surface of registration where all the production lays. They talked about an enchant surface of inscriptions through which capital make it to become the productivity and the modalities of appropriation and exploitation by evidencing the fundamental vector, which is speed, incarnate by money. This is not a somatic of capital as an incorporation logic of everything that is assumed or is opposed and sublet, as a translation machine and codification of the battles in the captured structure mentioned at the beginning. However, without corporates, this idea of axiomatic puts us again in the abstraction plan. Is it possible to remove the capital, the use of the term, and think of the terrain or the social reproduction as inscription, enchanted surface? Is it about this in the sense of Silvia Federici says, that is by a competition to the fetishist enchantment of the capital, the reproduction as surface of enchanted property has a general character as long as it involves everyone, because precisely it is in their production the desire of experience the persistence of the existence and all the necessary arrangements to expand it, which I like to call vitalist pragmatics. In that sense, we can say that many of the feminist initiatives are those insisting on reading the social reproduction directly as an international order, and built by the pandemic by exploiting in simultaneous the acceleration of extractive dynamics, particularly in our continent. I would say that the pandemic not only unveiled but also changed the articulation logic between those contradictions that are here to deploy the capital in a word against social reproduction by intensifying, as I said, the extractive dynamics. To conclude, we can start to confirm an immense group of debts, an expression of poverty, to paraphrase the analysis of the market. To start to research and analyze the debt is a way to understand the expropriated religion, and in this sense they respond to needs. We need to distinguish in that passage of the consumption to survival. However, the accumulation of debts aims to be proposed as the index of the loss of collective power by the workers, whether they are recognized or not recognized, salaried or not salaried, of the collective definition of those who produce the social richness, and from there their attempt to work as a device for pacification. But as I say in a second time, that pacification is to be done by a way of activation to which the debt appears as an privileged extractive device. In that sense, I wanted to think about what type of revolt, of commotion, is this new wave of financial is here to capture. You see, with the feminist movement, the dynamic of the reproductive work, as I said, is on the center of the public debate, along with an updated map on violences with collective tools for fight, such as strike, violence, and work. The contact zones and superposition with the realities of this informalized work are huge, which allows the feminist movement to evidence as a movement which is at the same time labor of class, at the same time broaden that category and that cartography thanks to their capacity to be antagonists of the debt, and from there try to think of the material conditions it is deployed. The confrontation, open confrontation plans are understandable in which at a certain grade due to the feminist dynamics of politicization of the reproduction sphere appointed as a word of neoliberal violence. Whose are public services? Whose are production of food? Whose are housing? What type of threat do we have against the access to education? Whose are the fortunes? What debts are being created? What territories are being looted? Finally, debt as contention make us to think of it in this ambivalent dynamic between the emergency, the postergation or the postponement, and the way to dispute future possibilities. We may also complain or reclaim the speculation as a way of critical mass. We can also think the speculation as an imagination, and we can also action or activate fights against financial extractivism where the debt appears as a powerful strategy of political articulation. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. Quizás levante la mano y voy para allá. Thank you, Veronica. My name is Maria del Rosario. We know, yes, at least our faces are familiar. And thank you very much for this. Such a fantastic test, a great summary of what you have done so now, but also you have included new things that you're thinking about probably. I didn't want to be the first one asking a question, but since there was no one else, I'm taking this opportunity. I'm thinking about this in relation to what's happening in Colombia now, in a leftist government in the country's history, and the Francia Marquez, a black leader, who during the whole the presidential campaign advocated for a reinterpretation of the idea of debt as you are working this now, but also in terms of ecological debt on one hand, and on the other hand, of rehabilitation of care policies. This new pedagogy you are referring, feminist, which seeks to find ways to interrupt or disrupt this way of how the capital returns and neutralizes, and in the same way a pacification element, which I think it is clear, very clear for the Colombia case. And since in Colombia everything is about peace, they think about pacification plays on different roles, on different levels, and it's finally neutralized. Then my question to you is, part of what we are concerned at this time in Colombia is all this speech about care policies that make it to be successful from a feminist point of view. Disruption in the campaign is being now obstacle due to some dynamics for capital. And I would like to think along with you this notion of care. How can we re-articulate it from the debt, as you have mentioned? How can this be a place for speculation or reimagination, radical reimagination, but at the same time, that place that is again and again obstacled? Thank you very much for your comment and your question. I think that it is fundamental because first, I believe that many of our countries there is a long-standing debate on reproduction work, and that is monopolized by the word care. Then on one hand, it has a pedagogic and evident pedagogic function that has been useful to popularize or to make you popular this about gender mandates, salaried work, or what has meant historically that the care work is an unpaid work. But I believe there are several devices from NGOs until the ways we need to implement some public policies and others, and what they aim to is to reduce the term care. Using the term care, many of these dynamics we've been talking about. I do believe that from a more abstract standpoint, we have here this thing that when we choose a term and it is always used from a complexity, but at the same time, when it is operationalized, so to speak, there are some speeches, some public policies, it requires a minor abstraction level, a simplification level, and some mottos or slogans to reach to some broader audiences. But I believe that it is a permanent battle, and in the case of Argentina, we've been debating over this. We're debating over an integrated care system or law. There are thousands of bills presented, but the debate is first we have to recognize the community caretakers, not to think only of parent leaves, which is the most classical device, to take it to other levels and to think about the recognition of the dynamics of community care. Then that also tensions the unions because or syndicates that implies the recognition of some way of working that has not been recognized. On the other hand, it is always something present on how to continue or not to continue conditioning that care policies to gender mandates we've been debating, to identifying those who are recognized as caretakers and reinforcing some stereotypes, existing stereotypes. And I believe that's another battle. Now, this, what we have here, this ecological debt, I believe this is a key to open terms such as the one of debt and also the one of care, and to think what care would be in terms of territories. Then this is where I see a permanent dynamics and some concepts, probably some terms and debates became famous during a period of time, and then they are simplified, so to speak, and also simultaneously we need to reopen them and to reconnecting them with problems that continue to be present. Because one again, the policies of care can be perfectly be all right with those focalized neoliberal policies and use the place in multiculturalism occupied in 90s. Then I think this is a sort of permanent dispute. Then it also seems to me that it is interesting what that type of term is the one that is becoming more popular and is under a dispute and is part of the shared vocabulary. Those should be markers or indexes indicating until which degree they intervene in the feminist movement and in the political and conceptual debates. Thank you very much. Very interesting what you have said. I would really like to know whether you have any thought about the capacity or what we call this financial extractivism. The capacity has to influence and encourage speeches, what we could call the populist right in many places. For example, the Trumpism in the United States, but at the same time, some aspects of the Robert Kennedy campaign, which is a suspiciously Democratic and Republican candidate, well, or Vox in Spain, among other examples. It seems that many of the motivation of these people is precisely a reaction against the financial extractivism. Paradoxically speaking, of course, I don't know if you have any opinion on it. A resistance against the financial extractivism encouraging the growth and the proliferation of a speech by the right wing in some groups of the population. I don't know if I have understood your question, but on one hand, I think that there is an affinity between these dynamics from the right wing. And now we talk about the populism as a term that would be more complicated. And this expansion, or what we call subjectivities of the speculation, which are related to how to reorganize daily survival in this, in those type of situations, and how we can try to demoralize this speculative of popular mass generalized that only reads in a realistic manner what needs to be done to survive. Not to mention the case of cases where the inflation is 100%, such as in Chile, where money is not enough for even 1 week. So I'm interested in how to decouple the idea of speculation from the great capital and others in a way of political subjectivity that has and makes speculation a way of survival and to lead with social reproduction conditions. Now I see a problem here, and since it's been done before and it's been done again, when we adhere to that popular subjectivity, the name of the right wing or the popular classes became right wing, and popular classes want to be financially speculated. The only thing they want to do is not work, you see? And it seems to me that there is a trap where we are usually set up, and we avoid the problem of thinking what is the right-wing understanding by that way of speculation organized by social reproduction. And then I believe on a more microstructural level, you have some examples such as in El Salvador, where the proposal is prison for the youth and Bitcoin economy, as a proposal for Latin America, repression and financialization in the speculative sense of great capital. Then what I am interested in is how to make that discrimination of those speculation ways and how to understand those popular subjectivities without attributing a political orientation of the right wing. In parallel, how we see how right-wing speeches can clearly read and connect and understand and this show that realism I was talking about in a more efficient way, even better than progressist and left speeches, which I still believe are under a moral condemn to a speculation and projecting an idea of popular subjectivity that doesn't have anything to do with the material conditions of reproduction today. I read your books a lot, so it's been a pleasure to me. I would really like to reflect upon the impact on the death due to maternity, or rather than that, the right women have or don't have to be mother, or the autonomy of their bodies.
It's something that it's very current nowadays, how to the maternity and maybe penalize, and it's the current station of poverty. Discussions were the political about the maternity and how it's penalized for certain sectors, and it becomes into a condition of impoverishment, really. So I think there's also a problem there, and a discussion from in the ways of family and maternity that the right wing knows how to read very well, in the precarity of the women to sustain these one-parent, single-parent homes, and this political orientation of how the situation is lived in those homes, where the configuration, affective and sexual, is changing very fast, and the ways of the incomes is changing as well. There's a big debate in Argentina, and I think also here in Chile, about the reclamation of the parental quote. The parent quote has, so the debt of the mother sometimes, a lot of times, have to do with no payment of the father payment quote. And so that started to be discussed as a debt. So who are we owing the money to? So the decision of the mother is an important thing in any reunion. It's like infinite malabarism, because they have a debt as a mother to be able to take them to school, and how they need their money from their father, the father of the kid, etc. So there's an absenteeism of the economic contribution of the parents. So that translates today in very practical actions. For example, lists of people that are having debts in these subjects. So I think it's very important to rethink the economic violence in homes, to think this change of the person who manages the household. So also to argue of who takes care of the kids, and what kind of debt that we are sustained because of the overload of caring. So that also exploded on pandemic, because they had to stop the remunerated labors, and who were those who also had extended care with other families. So that kind of problem was read as a part of the debt, and it was very interesting, because again it shows economic dynamics that were completely hidden, with the idea of the naturalization, the love and the abnegation of the mothers. So the destruction of the idea of the abnegation of mother is fundamental to think these issues. I just want to thank Veronica, her excellent presentation, and now I want to invite you, everyone, to our little reception that we have in the Andrés Bello yard. Thank you very much.